Well, my wife and I, we're big fans of mystery stories. And if you've ever read a mystery story, or maybe you've watched a mystery movie or a detective movie, it seems like they often end up being about the subject of murder. Now, there may be some Christians who feel like murder mysteries might be something inappropriate for Christians to enjoy. But most murder mysteries, they don't glorify murder. They don't glorify the sin. Usually the point of those stories is to show us the triumph of justice, and that someone's sin will ultimately find them out. They're going to get caught. We know that. We look forward to that. The bad guys always get punished. The good guys always win, except for the unlucky person who might have been murdered. It's a little late for them to win. At least that's the way it happens with Miss Marple, or Hercule Poirot, or Perry Mason, or Columbo, or Jessica Fletcher on Murder, She Wrote. But a common theme in establishing guilt in one of these stories is to prove three different things. To prove means, motive, and opportunity. Now, establishing those three things for somebody doesn't necessarily prove that that person's guilty, but they're often very important things to think about when solving the case. In a murder mystery, for instance, the means refers to how that crime was committed. And that would be that the way that the crime was carried out. It might be a weapon of some type was the means. And the motive, that answers the why question. Why was this crime committed? Why did this person feel like they needed to kill this victim or do whatever they did? Well, usually the perpetrator had some kind of reason why they took that action, often because they stood to benefit from that crime in a certain way. And then the opportunity, that refers to the timing, that refers to the planning of the crime, often being in the right place at the right time to commit the murder. Now, don't get the wrong idea. I'm not here today to teach you how to become a detective or how to solve a crime. But those three components, I was thinking about them, means, motive, and opportunity. They're also the way that I've categorized some lessons for you this morning that I've drawn for helping us to face challenges that we encounter in our lives that might call for us maybe to step out on faith, to do something that maybe takes us out of our comfort zone a little bit. So I've titled this sermon, Means, Motive, and Opportunity. And to begin the sermon, I want to look at the example of David. We know David. He was a shepherd in the area of Bethlehem. When we're introduced to him, he was still a young fellow who kept sheep. And it says he played the harp. He certainly wasn't considered a great hero at the time for doing that. But David stepped up to a challenge. Now, David is remembered for killing the great giant of the Philistines, Goliath. Now, David, he could have stayed a shepherd. He could have stayed a musician. But he was compelled to step out of those roles at one time in his life, to put himself ahead of the entire Israelite army in facing the Philistine champion. So for the structure of today's sermon, I'll be going through these three components of means, motive, and opportunity in the reverse order. Well, because that's the way they show up in the story of David conquering Goliath. So we're going to look at how David stepped out on faith in terms of the opportunity, the motive, and the means. And in doing so, I think that maybe we can learn several lessons that we can apply to situations that we might be facing in our lives, where we're considering whether we should step out of our normal routine, whether we should step out of our comfort zone and do something in faith. Well, first, let's consider some background information about David. Now, who was David? What was David comfortable with doing? Well, let's turn to 1 Samuel 16. 1 Samuel 16 is where we have the well-known story of David being anointed king by the prophet Samuel. 1 Samuel 16. This is where Samuel journeyed to Bethlehem to anoint a new king from among Jesse's sons. So here in 1 Samuel 16, God said at the end of verse 1, I have provided myself a king among his sons. And then in verse 5, we see that Samuel told the elders of the town this explanation for why he was there. That he had come to sacrifice to the Lord. He consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. He set them apart. He made sure that they were ceremonially clean and able to come to the sacrifice that was to be made. But there was one of Jesse's 8 sons who didn't come to that sacrifice. If we look at verse 11 here in 1 Samuel 16. Samuel said to Jesse, are all the young men here? Then he said, there remains yet the youngest, and there he is, keeping the sheep. And Samuel said to Jesse, send and bring him, for we will not sit down till he comes here." So he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy, with bright eyes and good looking. And the Lord said, "Arise, anoint him, for this is the one." Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. We see that the youngest David was a shepherd. He was a shepherd. He kept the sheep. He had developed those skills that were necessary for being a shepherd. And yet David was the one chosen by God to lead Israel and to be their king. I plan to come back to this verse a little bit later in the sermon after we look at what David accomplished in facing Goliath. So let's look at the challenge of David facing Goliath in terms of opportunity, motive, and means. Let's go to the next chapter, 1 Samuel 17, as we look at this component of opportunity. Verse 1. Now the Philistines gathered their armies together to battle, and were gathered at Socoh, which belongs to Judah. They encamped between Socoh and Azekah and Ephes-dammim, wherever those places are. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together. And they encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in battle array against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. So maybe you can picture this. Think about these two mountains and the valleys. We have these two armies they're lined up. They're facing each other on two hills separated by a valley. In verse 4, and a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines, named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. Goliath was tall. They call him a champion. Now a normal person would be 4 cubits tall. But Goliath was 6.5 cubits. So if a normal person were 6 feet tall, that would make Goliath about 9 feet and 9 inches tall. He would have easily towered over even the tallest man in the Israelite army. He must have been a very intimidating soldier. Let's continue in verse 5. Read what he was wearing. It says he had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. Now the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels, and a shield bearer went before him. When it describes all this metal, think of all the metal that this man was carrying. What's clear, he wasn't just a tall guy. He wasn't just a tall guy. He had to have been amazingly strong. He had to have been very muscular to wear that coat of mail, to carry all those weapons, and to use a spear of that size. Verse 8. Then he stood and cried out to the armies of Israel and said to them, "Why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And you, the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he's able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." Now when Saul and all Israel heard the words of this Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Goliath knew that he was stronger than any single individual in Israel's army. And he made an interesting offer. A man-to-man battle. That's what he wanted. He was stronger than anybody else, so man-to-man, that's a good odds for him. But the stakes that he offered were very high. The stakes involved one nation becoming enslaved by the other nation. In addition to the courage that any individual person would need to be able to muster to step forward to face Goliath, it's interesting to think about the army as a whole, how they would have felt. They couldn't just let any crazy soldier go down there and fight with Goliath. Well, let's say Bob volunteered to go fight with Goliath. Some guy from the army. He wouldn't just be putting his own life at risk. He'd be putting at risk the future of the entire nation. Because if the army were to let this guy go down to fight with Goliath, they'd basically be saying that if he were to lose, then everyone else would have to surrender. They would all serve the Philistines and be their slaves. Now that factor, in addition to the actual battle that would be going on, probably prevented most of the Israelites from even thinking about that. Nobody would want to be single-handedly responsible for Israel's defeat and the subsequent slavery of the entire nation. Let's continue in verse 12, because there was somebody that thought differently. It says, "Now David was the son of that Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse, and who had 8 sons," we talked about earlier. "And the man was old, advanced in years in the days of Saul. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had gone to follow Saul to the battle. The names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, next to him, Abinadab, and the third, Shammah. And David was the youngest. And the 3 oldest followed Saul. But David occasionally went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem." Now, David apparently did go back and forth between Saul's location and back to his home in Bethlehem, where he still cared for the family's flocks. Well, that's because, as you could read at the end of the previous chapter, David was moonlighting as a harp player, to soothe King Saul, to calm him down from time to time. So he had reason to be going back and forth. Verse 16, "And the Philistine drew near and presented himself 40 days, morning and evening." 40 days. Now, I'd think that the Israelite army, they would have gotten quite tired of being taunted for 40 days. It sounds as though the 2 armies were at a stalemate. You get the idea that things were kind of stopped because nobody was going to make a move until Goliath's challenge was answered. Verse 17. "Then Jesse said to his son David, 'Take now for your brothers an ephah of this dried grain and these 10 loaves, and run to your brothers at the camp. And carry these 10 cheeses to the captain of their 1,000, and see how your brothers fare, and bring back news of them.' Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. So David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with a keeper, and took the things, and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the camp as the army was going out to fight and shouting for battle. For Israel and the Philistines had drawn up in battle array, army against army. David left his supplies in the hand of the supply keeper, ran to the army, and came and greeted his brothers. Then as he talked with them, there was the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, coming up from the armies of the Philistines. And he spoke according to the same words. So he said what we heard earlier. And so David heard them. David heard those words that Goliath said, that he uttered. This was the opportunity. This was the opportunity. David had ended up in the right place at the right time. One of the points I like to bring out about opportunity is that opportunities come on their own. Opportunities come on their own. David didn't set out from Bethlehem that morning looking for a fight. No, he was carrying cheeses, he was carrying bread, he was going to visit his brothers. Now his older brother, Eliab, he might have disagreed with that. Because in verse 28, he accused David of being full of pride, wanting to come down, wanting to see the battle. But that's not the reason why David happened to be there that day. The timing had been out of his control. David was acting on his father's command. His dad told him to take the grains, the loaves, the cheeses to the army, and to bring back a report, tell him how his brothers were doing. He certainly didn't go there looking to be involved in the battle, looking to be a hero. He delivered the food as he was commanded, and then, since his father asked for a report about how his brothers were doing, it says he went to greet his brothers so that he could learn what he needed to know so that he could give a report back to his family. But while he was following out those instructions, while he was going about that business, David did end up in the right place at the right time so that he could make a difference. God gave him that opportunity to step out, an opportunity where he could act on the faith that he had. Now, when I say that opportunities come on their own, that doesn't mean that there aren't times in life where we seek out opportunities. It's good to seek out an opportunity. We might seek out an opportunity to serve. We might seek out an opportunity to help someone. We might seek out an opportunity to get a better job. But if you're already seeking out those opportunities, either that's searching is something you're comfortable or already doing, or you've already made a decision to step out of your comfort zone, to seek that opportunity. But today I'm thinking more about a situation where you might be really hesitant. Should I step out and do something, or should I hold back? Should I step out on faith, or should I not? And one of the things that we need to keep in mind is this concept of the opportunity. When God orchestrates things in our lives for us, He causes events to happen in a certain way. He can bring situations together that can provide for His people those opportunities that they need. And we need to be sensitive to be able to tell whether this is an opportunity where God does want us to step out and to demonstrate our faith on Him by relying on Him to see us through. A second point about the opportunity I wanted to bring out is that we should research our opportunities. So research your opportunity. If we continue this story in verse 24, we see that David didn't immediately seize upon this opportunity. He didn't just immediately run down there and attack Goliath. He took the time to research it. He made sure that he understood what the situation was, what it would mean. 1 Samuel 17 and verse 24, where it says, "And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were dreadfully afraid. So the men of Israel said, 'Have you seen this man who's come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and give his father's house exemption from taxes in Israel.'" Well, David appears to have heard these comments. Maybe he heard it from some men who were at some distance from where he was, because he decided to ask someone close by him, perhaps some people who knew or fought alongside his brothers. In verse 26, it says, "David spoke to the men who stood by him," those close by, and he asked, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" And the people answered him in this manner, saying, "So shall it be done for the man who kills him." So that he heard corroborating information from several people about the situation. He knew what would be done. In verse 28, "Now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men. And Eliab's anger was aroused against David. And he said, 'Why did you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle.'" Now David's older brother, you know the way brothers can be. He didn't like him asking around the camp, getting involved with something. It was just for the older brothers. He didn't want David to look any further into this situation. Verse 29, David responds, and David said, "What have I done now? Is there not a cause?" Then he turned from him toward another. So now he's looking at another soldier, and he said the same thing. And these people answered him as the first ones did. So he asked another group of people what would be done for the man who took away this reproach. And we see that even though he'd heard this answer before, David asked this question again to another group of people to find out what exactly will be done to the man who kills Goliath. Well, when you are presented with an opportunity, when you're thinking about what to do, you don't have to immediately jump in and start doing it. It's often good to take a little time. It's good to take a little time and evaluate that opportunity, to think about it so that you really understand it. Read the fine print. Do I know which of the king's daughters I'll get to marry if I kill this Philistine? Because it might make a difference. It's good to check with other people, as David did, to make sure that you fully understand the situation. It is good for us to get all the facts. We shouldn't jump in without all the information sometimes. Now, of course, we do have faith in God. We know that He'll work everything out, that all things work together for good. But that doesn't mean that we should be foolish. It doesn't mean that we should fail to perform any due diligence needed to know exactly what it is that we're getting ourselves into. We often don't have to go and seek out opportunities to step out of our comfort zones or to face new challenges. Often they'll present themselves to us whether we've asked for them or wanted them or not. And when such an opportunity does come, we don't have to plunge in immediately. It's wise to do the research just like David did. It's important to understand the parameters, the ramifications of taking on that challenge. And I think that God expects us to be wise. God wants us to be wise. He wants us to be informed as much as we can about whatever challenge we might be facing. So those are just a few thoughts about the component of opportunity. Let's continue in verse 31 of 1 Samuel 17 as we look at the component of motive. We're now going to look at motive. Let's look at why David would want to battle Goliath. Well, the first point I want to bring out about motive is that our motive can't be selfish. Our motive can't be selfish. When we're presented with some kind of an opportunity, we can begin to think selfish thoughts. Someone told me recently about a person who would take any opportunity that he could to go and to visit the widows and to care for them. I thought, well, that's a noble thing, right? God wants us to care for the widows. But it turned out that this person's motives, they weren't simply to care for these elderly ladies in an act of love. His goal was to get the widow to leave her estate to him. That's what he wanted. And he was successful at doing so. He wasn't motivated by concern for these women. He was motivated by getting a return on that investment of his time. Two people can appear outwardly to be doing the same thing. I think we know that. But the actions can be driven inside by different motives. And we don't always know what someone's motive is. That man who was stealing inheritances by visiting widows, he was motivated by selfishness. He wasn't motivated by love. And when we are presented with an opportunity, and when we're in that process of deciding, is this something where we should go forward with this opportunity or not, it's good for us to think about what our motivation is. If we find that the only reason I'm really interested in this opportunity is because of what I can get out of it, whether it's money, whether it's admiration from other people, then we have the wrong motive. And we shouldn't follow that opportunity. What was David's motive? Selfish? Well, you could argue that either way. Looking at this, if David killed Goliath, what would happen? Well, he'd be a hero. Everyone in the army would take note of him. He would be well known. And you might remember back in verse 25 that David stood to benefit substantially if he were successful. He would receive great riches. He would receive the king's daughter and a tax exemption. And I've heard of people that would kill just for the tax exemption. But was David selfishly motivated by those things? And he did ask about them a few times. Or was he motivated by standing up for what is right? Which brings me to my second point about motive, which is that standing for righteousness is a good motive. Standing for righteousness is a good motive. Let's turn to verse 31 here in 1 Samuel 17 and see what motivated David. 1 Samuel 17 and verse 31. It says, "Now when the words which David spoke were heard, they reported them to Saul, and he sent for him." So when David had been asking these questions around the camp, he'd been asking questions to a number of soldiers. Well, word got around. And someone told the commander-in-chief about David. So David went to meet with Saul. Verse 32, David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." Well, David volunteers to engage Goliath in a fight. This fight that he'd been looking for 40 days. But what is David's motivation? Why does he want to go into this battle? Well, we see in the statement that David said, "Let no man's heart fail because of him." Well, apparently the Israelites were discouraged. The Israelite army was frightened. Goliath had been taunting them for 40 days, and they were probably all ready to give up. They didn't have a champion who they could take forth and send out to face Goliath. Verse 33, "And Saul said to David, 'You're not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are a youth, and he a man of war from his youth.' But David said to Saul, 'Your servant used to keep his father's sheep. And when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it rose against me, I caught it by its beard and struck and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, And this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God. Here we begin to see David's motive. We begin to see his reasoning come to light, why he wants to get involved. He calls Goliath uncircumcised, which is a reproach, and explains that Goliath had defied the armies of the living God. Verse 37, moreover, David said, the Lord, who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. David's motive was a righteous one. He wasn't going to let God and his people be insulted by such an unclean man. Something needed to be done. He was willing to take a stand for righteousness. And when he talked with Saul, it's clear that his motivation is noble. And if you look down to verse 45, down in these verses where David's talking directly to Goliath, it's even more clear that David had a pure motive in wanting to kill Goliath. It's 1 Samuel 17 and verse 45. Then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. David wasn't going into this battle to make himself look bigger, for his own aggrandizement, but as he says in verse 46, he's going into battle that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. He even makes it clear that the battle wasn't his in verse 47, for the battle is the Lord's. It can be tempting to look at an opportunity to do something, to step out on faith, to face a new challenge in terms of what it means for me. From a selfish perspective. Do I look at an opportunity with the thought about what I can do for other people? What can I do for my family? How will doing this help my friends or my church family? We should never step out into a challenge just to prove a point or just to make ourselves look more important. Increased pride is a bad motive. Sometimes other people will attack our beliefs in an attempt to destroy the relationship that we have with God. And in those cases, when we stand up for righteousness, when we stand up for doing what we know to be right, that can be uncomfortable for us. For example, it might mean being willing to tell our employer that we're going to have to quit our job because they want us to start working on the Sabbath. We may not know where God is going to lead us in that situation, but we know that we have to take a stand for righteousness, and we can't compromise. In those cases, we do need to take action. So those are a few thoughts about the component of motive. Let's look now at the third element of means. Did David have the means to kill Goliath? What was it going to take to bring down this 9-foot giant? And it's all well and good to have an opportunity and to have the right motivation about doing something. The whole Israelite army, they were being ridiculed day after day by Goliath. They were all there. Every one of them had an opportunity to take action. But I'm sure that there were some in the army that even had the right motivation. I want to get rid of this guy for the right reasons. They wanted Goliath to be slain because he was insulting the living God and his chosen people. But was there any man in that army who actually had the means to take care of that situation? It would have been foolish if it were a soldier who only had an opportunity and a motivation to engage Goliath without also having the means to be successful, without having a plan. So go back now to verse 38 of 1 Samuel 17. If David was going to go into battle, well, he needed to be prepared. So Saul, who was leading the army. He wanted to make sure that David was properly equipped for what he was about to do. So reading in 1 Samuel 17, verse 38, it says, "So Saul clothed David with his armor, and he put a bronze helmet on his head, and he also clothed him with a coat of mail." Well, as we know, David, he wasn't in the army. He wasn't a soldier. He didn't have his own equipment. He didn't have that right equipment to start with. Now, if you remember back when it was describing Goliath, well, what was Goliath wearing? Well, he was wearing armor, a bronze helmet. He was wearing a coat of mail. Saul was just trying to ensure that David had the same advantages and would be evenly matched against Goliath in terms of his equipment. Now, it certainly wouldn't be fair if Goliath was wearing all this protection, his helmet and this armor, and the one going out from Israel didn't have those same basic protections, right? That would be the conventional wisdom. Verse 39 says, "David fastened his sword to his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. And David said to Saul, 'I cannot walk with these, for I have not tested them.' So David took them off. He took off that armor." And that brings me to the first point I wanted to bring out in terms of means. We aren't called to abandon our existing talents and abilities. We aren't called to abandon those existing talents and abilities. There wasn't anything wrong with what Saul did. There wasn't anything inherently wrong with Saul equipping David to go into battle. It was only right that he should have those same military advantages as his opponent. But, as David rightly pointed out, he hadn't tested them. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't someone who had trained and marched for weeks and months with that equipment on. He hadn't practiced using that equipment so that it would be second nature for him in a battle. If we're evaluating an opportunity that comes to us, and we're wondering whether we should step out on faith and to take this opportunity, does that opportunity require us to have skills or talents that we haven't yet tested? Does it require us to have abilities that we haven't started to develop yet? Let's look at what David did, continuing in verse 40. "Then he took his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, and put them in a shepherd's bag, in a pouch which he had, and his sling was in his hand. And he drew near to the Philistine." Verse 41. "So the Philistine came and began drawing near to David, and the man who bore the shield went before him." So why? Why did David defy conventional wisdom and take only a staff, a sling, and a few smooth stones? Well, let's briefly read verses 34 and 35 again. "David said to Saul, 'Your servant used to keep his father's sheep. And when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it rose against me, I caught it by its beard and struck and killed it.'" So David had battle experience. Not against a man, not against an army, but he battled against animals when he was protecting the sheep. David already had fighting ability. It's just that it was a little bit unconventional. But was David simply staying with what he was comfortable with by refusing to try those new weapons? Should he have taken the new weapons and tried to grow as an individual in doing that? David was comfortable with the staff and with the sling, but he wasn't comfortable with the sword, with the armor. Should he have stepped out of that comfort zone? Should he have been willing to use different weapons for this different opponent? Well, the answer is no. When God gives us an opportunity like this, He doesn't suddenly expect us to become experts with abilities we've never tried before. And we need to keep that in mind when we face new opportunities to step out in a new area. If this is an opportunity that God is giving to us, most likely we're going to need to build on the talents and abilities we already have. We're going to build on those things we already know how to do instead of abandoning them and doing something brand new. And that leads me to the second point about means. The second point is that God can magnify our natural talents and abilities. He can magnify them. If we continue in verse 36, where it says, "Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God. Moreover, David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. David knew that God would be doing the delivering, not his own talents, not his own abilities. Now, David had raw abilities. He was able to use the sling. He was able to use the staff. So he had the abilities and talents to use those weapons skillfully. But David knew that this wasn't just any adversary. Now, this wasn't just any lion coming. This was somebody who had defied the armies of the living God. And just as God had always delivered him when he was fighting against these animals, from the bear, from the lion, God could magnify those talents. David knew that God could give him the aim and the strength that he needed against Goliath. If we continue reading in verse 48, go down to verse 48, we read this. So it was, when the Philistine arose and drew and came near to meet David, that David hurried and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. Then David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone, and he slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his sword, and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. So David killed Goliath with the stone and the sling. David was already skilled with the sling, but God blessed him. God blessed that ability that he developed. And God was the one that made sure that aim was just right. That it would hit the giant in just the right place, with just the right force to conquer him. God was able to take those talents. He was able to take those abilities that David had developed throughout his youth and use them, not to save a flock of sheep this time, but to deliver the entire nation of Israel. God magnified David's abilities. When we have an opportunity where we can step out of our comfort zone and face a new challenge, we typically should not be required to suddenly and miraculously develop brand new skills that we hadn't had before. There's usually a reason why God has worked with you. There's a reason why you've developed certain skills throughout your life and certain talents, certain abilities. Now, we might be called on to use those talents. We might have to use those abilities in a brand new way that we'd never thought of before as we face a new challenge. And God could magnify those talents and abilities when we have the right motivation. It's amazing how God can take these talents, these skills that we already have, that we've developed maybe in some whole other area of our lives, and then He can use those for His service. And He can use those in ways that we never would have imagined them being used. So those are a few thoughts about the component of means, wrapping up the means, motive, and opportunity for David to challenge Goliath. I'd now like to go back to a verse we read in 1 Samuel 16, when Samuel was setting David apart as the king of Israel. I want to draw your attention to verse 13. Verse 13, where it says, Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. You know, that's a very important thing for us to keep in mind. Was that he had God's Spirit. God's Spirit gives us the courage that we need to step up to a challenge. God's Spirit gives us courage to step up to the challenge. After David was anointed king, it says that God's Spirit came upon him from that day forward. God had even been working with David before He gave him His Spirit at this point. Because if you remember back to verse 1, God said that He had already provided Himself a king among Jesse's sons. This shows that God works with us. He prepares us. He trains us even before He gives us His Spirit. Well, God's Spirit can come upon us too. And we can receive that Spirit through the laying on of hands when we are baptized for the remission of sins. And that Spirit, Jesus Christ in us, is the key to having that courage. It's the key to having the courage to face whatever troubles we're going to encounter in life. And that was the main factor that made David successful in facing Goliath. A big factor that keeps us from having courage to step out and leave our comfort zone can be anxiety. And we don't know how it's going to turn out. We're a little bit worried. I've never done this before. Worry and fear, that can paralyze us sometimes. If we look at 2 Timothy chapter 1, verses 6 and 7. Turn to 2 Timothy chapter 1, verses 6 and 7. We see that God's Spirit can help us to overcome those obstacles. It can help us to overcome anxiety, worry, and fear. 2 Timothy 1, verse 6. Therefore, I remind you to stir up the gift of God which is in you through the laying on of my hands. But what is this gift? What is this gift that we can receive through the laying on of hands? Well, it's the Holy Spirit. Verse 7. For God has not given us a spirit of fear. We don't have to be afraid, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. When we rely on God's Spirit, we don't have to be afraid. We don't have to live a life of worry. He gives us a sound mind so that we can see situations clearly. It gives us that power that we need to achieve whatever it is that we need to do. So how do we make use of this Spirit? How do we bring it to bear in any particular situation? How can we benefit from that power that God's Spirit can provide for us? Well, let's look briefly at Philippians chapter 4, verse 6. Go back a few pages to Philippians 4 and verse 6, where Paul gave some instructions for what we can do when we do become worried and fearful. Because even with God's Spirit, we feel worried and fearful sometimes. But we can do something about it. Philippians 4 and verse 6. He writes, be anxious for nothing. Don't be worried about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. God can guard our hearts. He will guard our hearts. He will guard our minds, giving us peace instead of anxiety. And He does that through the power of His Spirit living in us and working with us. The instruction that Paul gives in verse 6 is to let our requests be made known to God. Well, God wants us to bring our needs to His attention by asking, by prayer, by supplication. God already knows what we need. He knows what you need. But He likes to be asked. He likes to be asked for help. Because when we do that, it shows Him that we're relying on His help, that we need Him to help us. And we ask for it instead of just expecting it to happen. Another thing to note is that our requests to Him should be accompanied with thanksgiving. It mentions that we should bring thanksgiving. It's a pretty simple process here that Paul is describing that can set us free from anxiety. To thank God for what He's done for us, and then to ask Him for help. Now that sounds simple. As simple as that might sound, a lot of people aren't willing to do that. A lot of people aren't willing to do it. David, that we've been talking about, David was known for always giving thanks to God. And we can read all these psalms that he wrote, where he praises God, where he thanks God over and over. He continually also asks God for help. He had both of these elements in his psalms. He continually asked God for His help, and he continually thanked Him for that help that he'd already received throughout his life. God's Spirit, it's there to help us too. It's there to set us free from anxiety, to set us free from fear, to give us peace, love, and a sound mind. We can't underestimate the importance of God's Spirit in helping us to face challenges in our lives. Let's look at Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 5. And we can see a confirmation that God will strengthen us. God will provide us deliverance. Hebrews chapter 13, verses 5 and 6. We'll start here in the middle of verse 5. For He Himself has said, I will never leave you, nor forsake you. So we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me? Well, fear is one of those biggest obstacles that we have for stepping out of our comfort zone, for facing a task or a challenge that we don't feel ready to handle. So it's important to always keep in mind this point. God was with David and gave him his Spirit so that David was able to be bold, that he could boldly say that God was his helper. He could overcome those fears that he may have had in facing Goliath. And in the same way, God has offered to give us his Spirit. And when we have received that Spirit, he promises not to leave us. He promises not to forsake us. And to use that helper to deliver us from fear and anxiety. When we have that knowledge, when we understand that, it can help us to be more bold. It can help us to feel confident that when we do face a challenge, that if it's something that God wills for us to do, he's going to back us up. He's going to see that we're successful in doing it. So to conclude the sermon, I wanted to look at some other biblical examples of people who stepped up to challenges, just some situations for us to think about, and briefly examine what their means, motive, and opportunity were. Now, we don't have time to turn to all of these, so I'm just going to give you a chapter reference. And you can look at these yourselves later if you'd like. First was Moses. In Exodus chapter 3, Moses is a man who grew up in Pharaoh's house, but he'd become a simple shepherd in the land of Midian. He'd left Egypt, he'd moved to Midian, and he was keeping sheep. Well, there was an opportunity that was presented to Moses. It wasn't something that he was looking for at all. He came out of the midst of a bush. Of all things, he was out there with his sheep, and there was a bush burning with fire, but it wasn't consumed. Well, that got his attention. And God told Moses to go to Pharaoh. Moses hadn't looked for this opportunity. He hadn't been thinking as he was out there with the sheep, let me come up with a plan to go visit Pharaoh and to bring all the Israelites out. He was happy in Midian, but God got his attention. He gave him an opportunity. And Moses took some time to research that opportunity. He did. He asked God a lot of questions about it that you can read. If I take you up on this offer, well, what am I going to tell them your name is? That was research that he was doing. Yeah. What happens if they don't believe me? Moses did his research. He asked God what to do in those eventualities. Now, what would Moses' motive be for leading the Israelites out of Egypt? Well, the motive, it wasn't Moses' idea. It was God's idea. God had heard the Israelites. He'd heard the people's cries. He wanted to give them a means of deliverance. He wanted to set them free from bondage. In no way was Moses motivated by selfishness in going to deliver the Israelites. He already had everything that he wanted there in Midian. He had a family, he had a job, things were going well. But what about Moses' means? Now, did he have the ability? Well, Moses knew how to speak, but he considered himself to be slow of speech, slow of tongue. He wasn't a good talker. How was he going to talk to Pharaoh? But God said that he would magnify that natural ability. God would magnify Moses' ability to speak because he's the one that made his mouth. And God even reminded him, I made your mouth. I can say whatever I want out of it. You have to remember that. God also equipped Moses with a couple of miracles. He said, here's some miracles that you can perform. Turning a rod into a snake, making his hand leprous, turning water into blood. That's some nice things to have if you're going to go to see Pharaoh. And to give Moses some extra confidence to help him feel confident, he agreed to even send Moses' brother Aaron along with him to help. So that's the example of Moses I wanted to bring out. Another example near that in the Bible is Zipporah. You might remember in Exodus chapter 4, that's Moses' wife. Zipporah was given an opportunity. An opportunity came upon her that she hadn't been looking for. You might remember in this case that God was angry at Moses. God got really mad at Moses and wanted to kill him because he hadn't circumcised their son. It says that God sought to kill Moses. So Zipporah was given an opportunity. This opportunity came along where she could save her husband. she could save Moses. Well, Zipporah's motive was to follow God's instruction so that he wouldn't seek to kill Moses. Now, it wasn't out of selfishness that she had to step out of her comfort zone. She wanted her husband to live. She wanted their child to live. Her means, well, what ability did she have? Well, she found a sharp stone. And she used that to circumcise their son. She really didn't want to do it. But she had the ability to do it, and as distasteful as that was to her, she was able to complete that task. I want to bring this one up because her example is an amazing one. It shows wives the important role that they have in helping their husbands to do what's right in the sight of God. A wife can't just say sometimes, well, my husband's in charge, and I'm just going to go along with him. When a wife sees that her husband is not doing what God requires him to do, she needs to take on that God-given role as a helper. She should be a helper. She should help him to meet whatever challenge there is. And in so doing, she could save her husband, like Zipporah did. And there are many examples that we could summarize, but let's look at the example of Esther. Esther, she became a queen of Persia at a time when there was a conspiracy by the Persians against the Jews. Esther hadn't sought out an opportunity to save her people, but that opportunity came. Esther's uncle Mordecai so eloquently described the opportunity that was presented to Esther in Esther chapter 4 and verse 14, where he says, "For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows? Who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Often when we're facing a challenge, when we're facing one of these opportunities, we don't know whether it's God's hand that got us into that situation or not. Well, in Esther's case, it definitely was. And Esther's motive, it wasn't selfish. She planned to stand for God's people selflessly, saying, "I will go to the king," which is against the law. She was going to break the law, and she said, "And if I perish, I perish." She wanted to take the opportunity because she did have a pure motive to put her life on the line to save her people. And as far as the means for Esther, it was known that anyone who attempted to go into the king's inner court without being called would be put to death, unless the king held out his golden scepter. But in chapter 5, Esther came up with a strategy. She came up with a strategy to use the means that she had at her disposal to gain an audience with the king, and ultimately to save her people. Because she did have that position as the queen. She had this opportunity. She had the necessary access to the king and the means to accomplish what was needed to face her ultimate challenge. There are many other examples that we could think about in the Bible where we could see people who stepped up to a challenge, who did something amazing and remarkable, who left their comfort zones and were successful. Well, you yourself will undoubtedly be presented with circumstances in your life where you aren't sure whether to meet a challenge or to let that challenge pass by. I hope that when you're trying to determine whether to step out on faith or not, that maybe you'll think back to these 3 points that we talked about today: means, motive, and opportunity. Because they're good tools that we can consider. We can think about those 3 components, how they might apply to a situation that I'm facing in my life. They might help me to examine that opportunity, to determine whether I should take action, whether I should step out and trust God. And if you do take action, if you do step out, if you do take that challenge, you can be confident. You can be confident that God's Spirit will give you the courage that you need to step up to that challenge, and that it will help to see you through.